In the very heart of Rome, where today thousands of tourists pause in awe before a giant of stone, once stood a monument that not only represented the power of the empire but also its most brutal face, the Colosseum. Under the scorching sun, among travertine and marble walls, up to 50,000 people gathered in a unified roar that shook the foundations of the arena. It was not merely a building, it was a stage where life and death intertwined in a spectacle designed to impress, terrify, and keep the Roman people united under the shadow of imperial power. The Colosseum was no ordinary entertainment space. Its very architecture was meant to convey grandeur and order. Every row, every corridor, every entrance arch spoke of organization and hierarchy, senators in the best seats, common citizens higher up, women and the poor in the uppermost tiers. There, Roman society represented itself, stratified, disciplined, subject to the same principle that governed the battlefield: Rome first, the individual second. What today seems inconceivable, public executions, mortal combats, massacres of exotic animals, was for Romans a common language, a form of political communication. The Colosseum did not merely entertain, it taught, reminded, and punished. Every combat, every shedding of blood, every beast's roar was a message to the crowd: the emperor's power was absolute, the law of Rome unbreakable, and any challenge would be met with pain and spectacle. In this space, fear and fascination went hand in hand. Thousands of voices screamed in fury as the sand was stained red, and every execution or fight was celebrated as a public lesson in discipline and obedience. The Colosseum was, ultimately, a theater of power, a political instrument as effective as the legions that conquered territories or the senators who decreed laws. Understanding it in context is key. What we see as barbarity, the Romans saw as civilization. In those stands, where the people found catharsis and the emperor legitimized his authority, one of the most fascinating and darkest faces of imperial Rome was constructed. Among all public punishments in Rome, few inspired as much fear as the damnatio ad bestias, the condemnation to die devoured by wild animals. This execution ritual became one of the most anticipated, and feared, moments of Colosseum spectacles. The procedure was as simple as it was cruel. The condemned, criminals, rebellious slaves, prisoners of war, or Christians during periods of persecution, were thrown into the arena unarmed, without armor, and without hope. Before them awaited hungry beasts, lions brought from North Africa, tigers from the east, hyenas from Nubia, bears from Germania, even rhinos and leopards that had traveled halfway across the world to become executioners. The contrast was brutal: defenseless men and women against creatures trained for violence and deliberately agitated for the spectacle. The audience, some 50,000 souls packed into the stands, waited in anticipation. There was silence at first, a murmur growing in intensity until the doors opened and the beast stormed into the arena. Then, the roar of the animals mingled with screams of horror, the clamor of the crowd, and the thunder of drums. The scene, horrific as it may seem today, was experienced as a symbolic act, Rome's power imposing itself over all that was wild, chaotic, and defiant of established order. The Romans did not see it as mere sadism. In their mindset, public execution had a clear purpose: to show the strength of the law, reinforce the emperor's authority, and remind the people that disobedience brought inevitable punishment. Each death was a visual lesson. The condemned represented betrayal or crime, the beast symbolized the relentless justice of the state. And the crowd, both witness and judge, participated in the ritual by applauding or booing, demanding spectacle and reaffirming through their voices the social consensus around imperial power. But beyond its political function, the damnatio ad bestias was also a spectacle designed to impress and fascinate. Organizers paid attention to every detail. The beasts were made to appear theatrically through hidden mechanisms, such as trapdoors or cages raised by pulleys. The roars echoed in the arena as if emerging from the earth itself. The audience did not merely witness an execution, they witnessed a choreography of violence where death was part of a carefully written script. The effect was devastating. Torn bodies, muffled screams, blood staining the sand became indelible images that the people carried with them as a warning. Those who survived witnessing such horror understood that Rome forgave no one. cruelty was not gratuitous, it was calculated, planned, ritualized. For those who died there, the arena offered no redemption, only the fleeting memory of a gruesome end. For Rome, however, the spectacle served a dual purpose: it entertained and educated. And in that mixture of applause, roars, and blood, the Colosseum became a stage where violence was transformed into a political message and justice into a collective performance. The Colosseum never rested. From the early hours of the morning until sunset, the arena was alive with the echo of screams, roars, and applause. But there was a moment of the day that marked a particular change in the rhythm of the games: noon. As the sun beat down on the white marble and scorching stone, the midday pause arrived. At first glance, one might think it was a time of rest, a truce for spectators to eat, talk, and escape the heat. However, for many, this interval was precisely one of the most anticipated moments: the hour of public executions. During this period, prisoners, slaves, deserters, rebels, and enemies of the state were brought into the arena. There, before tens of thousands of spectators, Roman justice was carried out in its rawest and most visible form. There were no trials or defenses, because the sentence had already been decided. The spectacle was in watching the punishment unfold. The forms of execution were varied and always theatrical. Sometimes, the condemned were crucified in the middle of the arena, turned into human symbols of suffering and punishment. At other times, they were forced to fight each other, but with useless weapons or without real protection, a parody of combat whose outcome was sealed from the start. There were also symbolic executions, macabre reenactments of classical myths and tragedies, prisoners forced to play roles in scenes where the ending was always their death, whether by fire, sword, or poison. The most disturbing aspect was that all this took place in an atmosphere of normality. While some chewed bread and cheese or drank wine, others watched men and women burn in pyres or collapse under blows. Everyday life and public death shared the same space, without apparent contradiction. For the Romans, this spectacle was not an act of gratuitous sadism but a moral lesson. Justice was served with blood, and Rome demonstrated that crime carried a visible and inescapable price. The public did not merely accept this violence, they demanded it. It was part of the pedagogy of fear that maintained social cohesion. Each execution was a reminder that no one was above the law and that imperial power was absolute. In the arena, transgressors were humiliated, punished, and eliminated before everyone's eyes, and the crowd learned, amid cheers and applause, that Rome did not tolerate disobedience. The midday pause was, therefore, a double ritual: a rest for the people, a sentence for the condemned. In that shared space, justice became spectacle, and spectacle became a political instrument. Midday at the Colosseum brutally reveals how the Romans managed to unite entertainment and social control in a single act, making clear that violence, for them, was not disorder but a tool of civilization. In Rome, the Colosseum was not only a space for executions and combat, it was also a theater of power, a place where culture, religion, and violence intertwined to create a spectacle that both fascinated and terrified. One of the most disturbing aspects of this fusion was the recreation of classical myths through the real deaths of condemned people. For the Romans, mythology was more than a collection of ancient stories, it was the soul of their cultural identity. It told tales of heroes and gods, of trials, sacrifices, and tragic destinies. The Colosseum, as a mirror of the empire, sought to materialize these narratives in flesh and blood, turning legends into macabre spectacles where the outcome was preordained: the death of the condemned. Examples recorded by chroniclers such as Martial are chilling. On one occasion, a condemned man was made to play Orpheus, the mythical musician who could calm beasts with his lyre. At first, the scene seemed like a poem come to life, the prisoner dressed as Orpheus, surrounded by calm animals listening to the music. But suddenly, a wild bear was released into the arena, and instead of succumbing to the spell, it mauled him in front of thousands of spectators. The fable became a bloody tragedy, and the audience witnessed real death as part of the performance. On another occasion, a criminal was forced to portray Hercules. Dressed in lion's skin and armed with a club, he was led to a pyre prepared in the arena. There, in a reenactment of the hero's mythical end, he was burned alive. The scene, wrapped in smoke and flames, was not merely an execution, it was a theatricalization of a myth, a lesson in which the hero did not ascend to divine glory, but a man of flesh and blood burned before the eyes of the public. Perhaps the most disturbing case was that of a woman condemned to portray Pasiphae, the queen of Crete who, according to mythology, mated with a bull and bore the Minotaur. In the Colosseum, the prisoner was placed inside a hollow cow-shaped structure, and before the spectators, the union with a real bull was suggested. It is unclear whether this was a simulation or an actual act, but the very fact of staging such a spectacle says much about the blurred boundaries between myth, theater, and violence in the Roman mindset. These dramatizations reveal a complex aspect of Roman culture. They were not simple executions, they were rituals full of symbolism, where human life became a dramatic resource, a means for the audience to feel that the foundational myths of their civilization remained alive, updated in the present. The message was clear: Rome not only ruled territories and men, it also controlled stories, rewriting them in blood on the arena floor. What is both fascinating and terrifying is how the Romans managed to see art in violence. For them, there was no contradiction in combining poetry and death, myth and execution. The Colosseum thus became a space where the imaginary took real form, and where the line between theatrical spectacle and cruelty blurred until it disappeared. These performances remind us that imperial Rome did not conceive entertainment apart from power or social pedagogy. Bloody mythology was not only an act of cruelty, it was also a cultural affirmation. In Rome, even gods and heroes could be reduced to ashes in the arena, under the gaze of the emperor and the applause of the people. When we think of the Colosseum, the first image that comes to mind is usually that of the gladiators, armed men fighting under the scorching sun, surrounded by the roar of tens of thousands of voices. Their combats were not simple duels, they were the heart of the Roman spectacle, the most anticipated moment for the crowd, and at the same time, one of the cruelest. The figure of the gladiator was filled with contradictions. On one hand, they were slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned men forced to fight without choice. On the other, some were free volunteers, known as auctorati, who enrolled in gladiatorial schools seeking fame, wealth, or the illusion of glory. For the latter, the risk was extreme, but the possibility of becoming popular idols was irresistible. In the arena, they could rise from obscurity to stardom, though that ascent almost always ended in blood. The fights were organized under a strict system. There were different types of gladiators, each with specific weapons and styles: the myrmidons, with decorated helmets and short swords; the secutors, designed to face the agile retiarii, who were lightly armed with only a net and a trident; and the hoplomachi, equipped in the Greek style with a spear and shield. This diversity was not accidental. The clash of different styles kept the audience engaged, turning each combat into a choreographed spectacle of contrasts and surprises. However, behind this apparent organization was a brutal reality. Training in the Ludi Gladiatorii, gladiator schools, was harsh, almost inhuman. Men lived under military discipline, subjected to exhausting exercises and a strict diet controlled by their lanisti, the owners of the schools, who saw each gladiator as an investment that had to pay off. They were taught to fight not only to kill but also to entertain, to prolong the fight, to perform dramatic gestures, to make blood and suffering a spectacle for the public. In the arena, a gladiator's fate depended on skill, luck, and often the crowd's thumb. If a gladiator was defeated, he could beg for mercy by raising his index finger. At that moment, the organizer of the show, usually a politician or even the emperor, decided whether he deserved to live or die. The crowd also intervened. If they demanded death, the loser was executed on the spot. This ritual of the thumb, whether up or down, was a reminder that in Rome, a man's life could depend on the collective whim. In the great games, like those offered by Emperor Trajan, thousands of fights were recorded within months. For the people, each victory was a cause for celebration, each death a cathartic spectacle. Some gladiators, after years of victories, achieved a kind of fame. Their names were cheered by the crowds, their portraits appeared in mosaics, and they even received gifts and affairs from noblewomen. Yet these exceptions did not erase the harsh reality: most died young, sacrificed in an entertainment machine that devoured lives relentlessly. The bitterest irony is that although gladiators could become idols, they remained slaves to the spectacle. Their bodies belonged to the empire, their glory to the people, and their fate to a thumb. The Colosseum arena was both their field of honor and their collective grave. For the Romans, these fights were a way to assert the greatness of the empire. Each combat reminded the public that Rome not only dominated nations but also men themselves, reducing them to pieces of a show. And yet, despite the brutality, gladiators embodied a paradox: they were slaves, but also symbols of courage, endurance, and valor. The echo of their cries still resonates through history, reminding us that behind the myth of the heroic gladiator were real lives worn down by the edge of a sword and the roar of a bloodthirsty crowd. If gladiatorial fights were the heart of the Colosseum, Naumachii were its most extraordinary, rare, and excessive spectacle. These were reenactments of naval battles within the amphitheater, a marvel of engineering that transformed the arena into an artificial sea where thousands of men, condemned to die, faced each other aboard ships. Organizing a Naumachia was so complex that it could not be repeated frequently. To flood the arena, Roman engineers designed sophisticated hydraulic systems connecting the Colosseum to nearby aqueducts. Valves, channels, and reservoirs allowed the arena to be filled with enough water for makeshift fleets to maneuver. Within hours, the stone floor became a lake where death rode its victims. The participants were not trained sailors, but mostly prisoners of war, slaves, or condemned criminals. They were given light boats, rudimentary weapons, and orders to fight to the death. At the start of the battle, it was common for everyone to salute the emperor with the famous phrase, "Ave Caesar, those who are about to die salute you." From that moment, the amphitheater became a stage of chaos. The ships rammed into each other, boarded with fury, and were set ablaze under the watchful eyes of tens of thousands of spectators. The water soon turned red with the fighters' blood, and their screams of agony mingled with the crash of splintering wood. There was no possibility of surrender. Naumachii were designed to end in total slaughter. According to Cassius Dio, in a single one of these spectacles, more than 3,000 men faced each other, and almost none survived. The public watched with a mixture of fascination and horror. For the Romans, these battles were not simple displays of cruelty, they were a manifestation of imperial power. By recreating past or fictitious wars in a controlled environment, the emperor showed that he could dominate not only land and human life but also water and fate itself. Each Naumachia was a tangible reminder of Rome's ability to transform nature and death into entertainment. However, the cost was enormous, not only in human lives but also in resources. Transporting water, ships, and prisoners to the heart of Rome required enormous sums from the imperial treasury. That is why Naumachii were rare, reserved for exceptional occasions such as imperial celebrations, military triumphs, or the inauguration of the Colosseum. When they occurred, they remained etched in the memory of those who witnessed them, as an unparalleled spectacle of grandeur and horror. The bodies floating, the muffled screams of those sinking under the weight of their armor, the water splashed with blood and entrails, all this made the Naumachia one of the most harrowing images of the Roman world. For spectators, it was a mix of awe and catharsis; for the condemned, a sentence disguised as war. The Colosseum, with its Naumachii, reminds us of the extent to which the Romans fused spectacle and violence. There, the line between reality and fiction blurred, and the sea became another stage where human life was sacrificed in the name of Rome's glory. Before the blood of gladiators and condemned men ran across the arena, the Colosseum opened with a spectacle that combined wonder and cruelty, the venations, or animal hunts. These events, held in the mornings, were far more than mere entertainment. They were a demonstration of imperial power, of Rome's ability to dominate nature and bring the wild to the feet of the people. The emperors spared no expense to impress the public. Animals from every corner of the empire were hunted, captured, and transported to Rome: lions from North Africa, tigers from Asia, elephants from India, bears from Germania, hippos from the Nile, crocodiles, rhinoceroses, giraffes, and even ostriches. Each species was a rarity that astonished the crowd, many of whom had never seen such creatures in their lives. Once in the arena, the massacre began. The animals could be forced to fight each other in impossible battles, such as a lion against an elephant or a bear against a bull. On other occasions, they were hunted by specialists called bestiarii, gladiators trained in taming and killing wild beasts. Armed with spears, bows, or tridents, these men turned the arena into a hunting ground in full view of tens of thousands of spectators. The results were devastating. In the inaugural games of the Colosseum under Emperor Titus, over 5,000 animals were sacrificed in a single day, and in the spectacles organized by Trajan, the numbers exceeded 10,000. The impact on wildlife was so severe that some species began to disappear from their natural habitats. What was a display of grandeur for Rome was an irreversible blow to nature. Behind the violence lay a profound political message. The Venations were not mere killings, they were allegories of Rome's dominion over the world. Each animal represented a conquered territory, and by watching them die in the arena, the people understood that even the most powerful creatures were subject to the empire's authority. Nature was subdued under the whip of Roman civilization. Yet not all Romans approved of this bloodshed. Pliny the Elder and other authors expressed their rejection of unnecessary cruelty and the extermination of rare animals. However, these voices were a minority compared to the clamor of the people, who demanded ever more astonishing spectacles. The Colosseum became a stage where the world's diversity was displayed only to be destroyed, turning life itself into mere entertainment. For the crowd, seeing an elephant collapse amid roars or a lion desperately fighting a hail of spears was not just entertainment, it was an experience of awe, a reminder that Rome ruled not only men but also the wild forces of nature. But behind every applause, behind every stifled roar, there was an incalculable price. Thousands of animal lives were extinguished in the name of glory and spectacle. On those blood-stained mornings, the Colosseum bore witness not only to human ferocity but also to the fragility of the wild in the face of imperial power. If the Colosseum had, for centuries, been the stage of Roman power, with the emperor seated in the stands observing from above, there was one ruler who decided to break that tradition. That man was Commodus, one of the most controversial and eccentric emperors in Roman history, whose name became synonymous with excess, tyranny, and morbid spectacle. Unlike his predecessors, Commodus did not settle for merely watching the games, he descended into the arena himself. Dressed in lion skins and wielding a club, he imitated his favorite hero, Hercules, proclaiming himself the living reincarnation of the demigod. But while Hercules fought mythological monsters in Greek epics, Commodus manufactured his own enemies, wounded, disabled, or unarmed men forced to dress as fantastical creatures to be slain before the crowd. On occasion, the emperor faced wild beasts. He boasted of having killed 100 lions in a single day, as well as ostriches, giraffes, elephants, and other exotic animals. Yet his combats were not true tests of bravery, the beasts were weakened or tamed to ensure his victory. Still, after each spectacle, Commodus demanded applause, shouts of admiration, and financial rewards taken directly from the imperial treasury. The most disturbing aspect was the theatricality of his human executions. Some accounts describe him decapitating defenseless men with his sword, then arrogantly showing their heads to the public. On other occasions, he used unusual weapons, such as curved-tip arrows, designed to maim rather than kill instantly, prolonging his victim's suffering. The Colosseum became a stage for his egotism, where the line between spectacle and tyranny blurred beyond recognition. For much of the Roman elite, these practices were shameful. Seeing the emperor, the ultimate figure of the empire, degrade himself into the role of a gladiator was considered a humiliation of imperial power. The Colosseum, meant to be a symbol of Rome, had become the personal playground of a bloodthirsty despot. Yet no one dared to stop him, the fear of his wrath outweighed their indignation. Ultimately, Commodus' reign ended as it had lived, surrounded by violence. He was assassinated in 192 CE, a victim of a palace conspiracy tired of his excesses. Yet his shadow remained etched into the history of the Colosseum. While other emperors used the games to project power and grandeur, Commodus turned them into a reflection of his narcissism and cruelty. The Flavian Amphitheater, already marked by the blood of thousands of men and animals, reached one of its darkest chapters under him. During his rule, the Colosseum ceased to be solely a stage for Rome and became a mirror of the degradation of imperial power.